9 months pregnant, Natasha Spencer watched anxiously from her 8th-floor window as the abandoned cars and buses piled up on South Shore Drive. One of the worst blizzards in Chicago history gripped the city in the winter of 2011, and Spencer was past her due date. Her obstetrician had offered to induce labor before the storm hit, but Spencer declined. As she watched the snowdrifts devour the vehicles on the road below, Spencer wondered if she should have listened. Spencer was nearing 40, so she was keenly aware that her pregnancy was high risk by medical standards. Throughout her pregnancy, she hadn't been able to shake a foreboding that was so intense and so out of character she didn't even tell her husband about it. She had opted for all the tests, even the amniocentesis, and all came out clear. At Spencer's 21-week ultrasound, the doctor went through her son's anatomy part by part and offered reassurance, his comforting words etching themselves into her memory. "That's a beautiful brain." Spencer's son also had impeccable timing. Keenan Spencer Vitchak, 8 pounds, 11 ounces with a full head of hair, was born on February 5, 3 days after the snowstorm ended, enough time for the streets to become passable, enough time for doctors to get back to work. Spencer introduced Keenan, her second child, to her Facebook friends with a photo of him swaddled and sleeping. "We are in love," she wrote. Before Keenan headed home from the hospital, there was one final test, a routine one for Illinois newborns. A nurse pricked his heel and collected blood for special filter paper that a state lab would screen for dozens of rare diseases. The Illinois Department of Public Health followed up with a sheet of paper bearing an unmistakable message: "All results are normal." Those 4 words doomed Spencer's child. A few drops of blood. That's all it takes to determine whether a baby who appears healthy at birth requires swift medical attention to avoid early death or severe disability. Though every state screens newborns, legislators in Springfield in 2007 passed a law that envisioned Illinois as a leader. The state lab in Chicago was to be among the first in the nation to test all infants for a group of diseases in which lysosomes, sacs of enzymes that serve as recycling centers for human cells, malfunction and wreak havoc on a child's body. Early treatment can extend life and prevent extreme suffering. Among the worst of these lysosomal disorders is Crab disease. Babies with Crab, pronounced Crab, are born with beautiful brains that later deteriorate. Their lysosomes don't make enough of an enzyme that helps create and sustain the protective coating around nerve fibers. Without that protection, brain cells die, and nerves throughout the body can't transmit their signals properly. The baby's bodies go limp, their jaws go slack. They lose their sight, their hearing and their sense of taste. As the swallow reflex wanes, they choke on their own saliva. The mere act of holding them upright can restrict an airway. Children with the most aggressive form of Crab disease typically die before age 2. New parents are used to chronicling the firsts of childhood the first time a baby smiles, sits up, crawls. But for parents of infants with Crab, this tradition is turned inside out. Instead, they are mindful of the last time a baby smiles, laughs, turns his head to make eye contact. The Illinois law set a goal of having statewide testing in place by November 2010, 3 months before Keenan was born. See more videos. Dr. Barbara Burton, who for decades has treated patients with Crab at Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago, pushed for this screening after a study in the New England Journal of Medicine reported that a transplant of stem cells from umbilical cord blood could slow or halt the nerve damage in newborns with Crab. That study found that stem cells harvested from umbilical cord blood donated after birth could be life-saving for babies born with Crab, but only if the transplant occurred before the nerve damage started. When the same doctors performed transplants on children already experiencing the devastating symptoms of Crab, the stem cells didn't reverse the damage or prolong life. The treatment wasn't a cure. A follow-up study of 18 babies transplanted in the first 7 weeks of life showed that 3 died of transplant complications, 1 died of a surgical complication unrelated to Crab, and 1 died of Crab at age 15. As the newborns grew up, all but a few used walkers or wheelchairs and needed speech therapy. But many families who had watched babies suffer and die from Crab saw these transplants as miraculous. Not only did most of the children survive a fatal disease, they could see, hear and express themselves. Though most developed cognitive skills at a slightly slower rate than typical children, they were able to attend school and learn. All of the newborns in the initial study were identified because they had an older sibling with Crab. Without screening, the only way to save a child with Crab is to lose one first. New York became the first state to test all newborns for Crab in 2006, spurred by NFL Hall of Fame quarterback Jim Kelly, whose son, Hunter, died of Crab. That same year, Burton prodded the Illinois Department of Public Health to begin testing but was turned down by a lab official who said he didn't have enough equipment or staff, records show. Burton didn't give up. She's someone who has to break the news to parents that the baby they thought was healthy was actually dying. And by the time these families showed up in her office, it was too late to do anything about that. Too many of her patients entered hospice when they should have been taking their first steps. She and families of children with lysosomal disorders took their cause to Springfield. With passage of the 2007 law, the Lurie doctor thought she'd finally be able to offer these babies and their families a chance at a better life. Instead, Burton got a lesson in how a sclerotic Illinois bureaucracy can be deadly. On Keenan's first Father's Day, Spencer snapped a photo of her son and 2-year-old daughter, Tamsin, curled up on the lap of their father, Dan Vidchak. Brother, sister and father, all sleeping peacefully. A short video that summer shows Keenan cooing and grabbing at a board book about zoo animals as Tamsin plops down and kisses one of his chubby legs. Another video captured Keenan's contagious laugh, more a squeal of delight really, as Vidchak lifts up his son repeatedly and kisses his cheek. Keenan's laugh, around 5 months, Spencer wrote on Facebook. What a joy it is to hear within weeks, Keenan became a fussy baby. Everyone suspected lingering pain from an ear infection was the culprit. Spencer looked for meaning in the moments when Keenan was at ease. She told her Facebook friends that her son always wanted to be outside, even in stifling temperatures, strapped to his mom's chest in the baby Bjorn carrier. Keenan liked facing outward, and Spencer wondered if this in itself was a personality trait, a sign that Keenan was an adventurer who would leave home at 18 and never come back. As we roamed the neighborhood, my mind would wander to the creative thinker I obviously had on my hands as he liked to be in constant motion, she wrote. It was easy to fantasize about his potential. With Keenan tucked into that carrier on her chest, Spencer had the perfect vantage point to spot the head tilt when it started. The state's newborn screening program was supposed to be immune from the budget pressures weighing on state officials as the Great Recession took hold. Screening newborns in Illinois is funded by a testing fee charged to hospitals for each baby born. The legislature directed public health to raise that fee to cover the new testing for Krabbe disease and other lysosomal disorders. But the state took so long to change the rules to allow a $19 increase for each baby, an extra $3 million a year, that the money didn't start accumulating until January 2010. It takes forever to get administrative rules through, recalls David Jinks, who was chief of the newborn screening lab at the time. It's a crazy system. You shouldn't have to do that. To make matters worse, the legislature in October 2008 passed a law that allowed the state to raid the newborn screening fund, taking $500,000 from it to pay for unrelated expenses. Lawmakers called this a sweep, as though the money taken from this account were dust bunnies on the state house floor. Public health officials periodically gave progress reports to panels of medical advisors, including the Genetic and Metabolic Diseases Advisory Committee and its subcommittees. They warned the committee that the newborn screening fund was running low and that the sweep could delay their testing plans for the lysosomal disorders. Indeed, the lab never even tried to hit the November 2010 goal the law had set for statewide testing. Instead, public health committed only to pilot testing by that date. Top state officials at that time, Jinks recalls, told managers throughout the department do more with less. Jinks and Michael Petros, the newborn screening lab's operations chief, studied the testing costs for lysosomal disorders closely. See more videos. No other state was screening its newborns for so many lysosomal disorders. New York's Krabbe screening relied on tandem mass spectrometers, machines that the Illinois newborn screening lab already owned. But Jinks and Petros figured out that Illinois still would need $2.1 million in additional equipment, plus costly lab renovations, to perform all the new tests using mass spectrometers, according to an analysis Petros included in his doctoral dissertation. When a private company proposed a cheaper alternative to mass spectrometers that looked promising, it was hard to pass up, even though the technology was new and unproven. Jinks says a scientist he trusted recommended this new technology, so in 2009, he made a fateful decision. He told the Genetic Diseases Committee that this method was less expensive, requires fewer staff to run and has a shorter turnaround time, state records show. Jinks and Petros calculated in their cost analysis that the ongoing price of the alternative tests would be $2.43 cheaper per baby. Looking back, Petros likens trying out the new test method to taking a car for a test drive. Being a government employee, you have a limited amount of money and staffing resources, he recalls. Is there a way to do this equally well but at a cheaper cost? But there was a major problem. The vendor pitching this new method had developed testing materials for 3 of the other lysosomal disorders but not for crab. Public Health contracted with the company anyway, after receiving assurances from the firm that the crab testing supplies were being developed, state records show. The state lab began a pilot test, screening babies from 2 Chicago hospitals for some of the lysosomal disorders. But the lab never tested any babies for crab, because the vendor failed to provide the necessary materials. The equipment couldn't accommodate the large number of blood samples the lab needed to process each day, and some results for one of the lysosomal diseases were not reliable, records show. Lab officials complained to an advisory panel that the testing process that sounded so promising wound up being very labor and time-intensive. In just 2 weeks in September 2011, Keenan lost the ability to use his hands. At first, he clenched his thumbs and flexed his wrists in odd ways, favoring one hand over the other. Then Keenan balled up both hands into tight fists and wouldn't let them go. The fussiness, the head tilt, there were plenty of reasons why healthy babies might display those behaviors. But there was no rationalizing this sudden loss of hand control. Keenan's pediatrician was alarmed too. The doctor grabbed the first available slot Lurie Children's Hospital had for an emergency MRI, a week away. But before that could happen, Keenan's screaming grew so extreme that it frightened Spencer. That night Dan Vidchak watched Tamsin while Spencer took Keenan to the nearest emergency room, Comer Children's Hospital at the University of Chicago. Around midnight, a medical resident told Spencer that a scan of Keenan's brain showed abnormalities that nobody could immediately explain. More tests were needed. The glare of the fluorescent lights felt sharp as panic welled up inside Spencer. "I now understand what fear is," she recalls thinking. That's an astonishing statement coming from Spencer, who as a graduate student was mugged by a man who pressed a gun to her back and demanded money. But that horrifying encounter involved her life. This was her baby's life, and there was nothing she could do to help him. At one point, Spencer told Keenan's nurses that she was so overwhelmed she was unable to take even a sip of water and asked that they give her an IV. A flurry of tests on Keenan followed. All were inconclusive. Dr. Darrell Waggoner, a University of Chicago geneticist who is the crosstown counterpart to Burton, told Spencer he suspected her son might have a form of leukodystrophy, the umbrella term for crab and other diseases in which the protective coating around nerve fibers gets destroyed. She remembers insisting Waggoner and his neurologist colleague had to be wrong. Keenan had a beautiful brain, a doctor had told her so. She remembers trying to defend Keenan's ability to engage with his environment by showing videos from her phone. See, Keenan could play with a zoo animals board book. He could laugh at his dad. This had to be temporary. My pleas seemed to go in one ear and out the other, she wrote on Facebook. Little did my frantic mind know that they could see what I couldn't, the road we were about to walk down. Waggoner ordered tests that would tell them definitively whether Keenan had leukodystrophy and, if so, which kind. They would have to wait 2 weeks for the results. Jenks retired from his job as newborn screening lab chief at the end of 2010, just before the pilot testing derailed. Public Health didn't fill his position. Instead, the department gave Jenks newborn screening duties to George Dizikes, a scientist who already was overseeing quality control and regulatory issues at all 3 public health labs. Newborn screening is handled by the Chicago lab, but there are also labs in Springfield and Carbondale. Together these labs test for contaminants in drinking water, lead in children's blood, pathogens in food, sexually transmitted diseases and other sources of outbreaks. Dizikes became the next in a parade of managers who were supposed to get crab screening up and running. In May 2011, he told a state advisory panel that lab technicians had to repeat too many of the testing runs in the pilot program because of the poor performance of the materials the contractor provided. He halted the pilot later that week. "You have to be a good scientist and say, this is not going to work," recalls Petros, the newborn screening lab's operations chief. Changing course, Dizikes asked the lab scientists to learn how to conduct the tests for all of the lysosomal disorders, including crab, using mass spectrometer machines, the method in New York State. He told an advisory panel that the state lab had enough equipment to start new pilot testing that fall. Burton, the Lurie doctor, sat on those advisory panels. Once so hopeful about what the new law could accomplish, she was now frustrated and skeptical. How could Dizikes switch out the 2 technologies so quickly? "I don't like it, but I guess he'll have to eat it," Burton vented in an email to the father who helped shape the 2007 law. "Honestly, the whole thing gives me a headache." 4 years after the crab screening law had passed, public health was back where it had started. Later that month, the Illinois legislature passed a new law mandating screening for 2 more lysosomal disorders. It gave the lab an extra 2 years to launch statewide testing for the original lysosomal diseases in the 2007 law, including Crab. Wagoner, the University of Chicago geneticist, was on his way to a conference in Montreal when Keenan's results arrived. He called Spencer to break the news. Keenan had the most aggressive form of Crab disease. Her son soon would be trapped in a body unable to communicate anything but the sensation of extreme pain. The question wasn't whether he would go blind and deaf, but when. Before long, he would be paralyzed and eventually would lose his ability to breathe. Keenan had a year, maybe 2, to live. At a subsequent appointment, the genetic specialist gently explained there were decisions to make. Did Spencer and Vitchak want Keenan to get a gastronomy tube, an easy surgical procedure that allows food to be delivered directly to his stomach? Without the feeding tube, Keenan would die sooner. Just 9 months old, he already was having trouble nursing. The sucking reflex is one of the first skills lost to Crab. Spencer couldn't bear the thought of Keenan starving to death. The answer, which seemed so obvious at the time, was yes. Years later, after witnessing the suffering that would follow, Spencer would question whether that was fair to Keenan. "I often think of the inherent nature of the illness," she wrote on Facebook. "It does not ask the child to live past the point of non-nourishment. But with a G-tube, we do. With that well-intentioned decision, and the next, he gets to live through the unraveling of his brainstem." Who is the cruel one in this dynamic? As Spencer suspected, it was too late for a transplant. She had flown with Keenan to Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh of UPMC to see Dr. Maria Escolar, the Crab expert who was the lead author of the New England Journal of Medicine study on transplants. Spencer learned from Escolar how to stay ahead of Keenan's symptoms with therapies and medications. On the last day of tests for Keenan, Spencer met a Dayton, or family with 2 young boys who had Crab. Oregon doesn't screen newborns for the disease. 1-year-old Michael Wilson had been tested as a newborn only because his older brother, Marshall, started suffering the symptoms of Crab. By the time he was diagnosed, it was too late for Marshall to be helped by a transplant. When Spencer saw him, Marshall was 2.5 years old, lying motionless in a reclined wheelchair. His mouth was slack, his facial expression absent. Over and over, his mother, Tammy, suctioned the secretions from Marshall's throat so that he didn't choke to death or wind up with pneumonia. Spencer couldn't imagine herself doing that. It terrified her. Yet, this was what was in Keenan's future. And there was Michael, who was just 4 months older than Keenan, holding himself upright in his mother's arms, hugging her. Had undergone a stem cell transplant earlier that year. 2 brothers with the same disease, 2 boys with dramatically different futures, were there in front of Spencer. Spencer and the Wilsons struck up a lasting friendship in a way that only parents who share that kind of devastating diagnosis can. Spencer and Keenan returned home with a new vision of the future. Rather than making their annual trek to Ohio for Christmas with the families of Spencer and her husband, they remained in Chicago that year. Keenan spent his first Christmas in pain. He was going through withdrawal from one medicine, and the 2 other drugs meant to replace it hadn't yet reached full strength. The muscle spasms and nerve pain were intense. The family made room for what would become a new tradition. Horizon Hospice sent a Santa to their home, as it does for all children in its care nearing the end of their lives. The Santa hoisted Keenan and Tamsin onto his lap, as though nothing in this ritual were out of place. That winter, another Illinois baby was starting to have symptoms of Crab. Robin Maubach, who lived in Washington, wondered if something was wrong with her son, Dylan. The first sign was a head tilt, a condition that physical therapy couldn't solve. Then there was Dylan's fussiness, which the pediatrician treated as reflux. Dylan initially met his early milestones, but his mother, a first-grade teacher mindful of child development, soon began to worry. Dylan's older brother sat up at 6 months. Dylan reached that age and never did. When he was 9 months old, Dylan stopped feeding himself. At first, doctors diagnosed Dylan with cerebral palsy. A visit to Children's Hospital of Illinois in Peoria led to the Crab diagnoses when he was 14 months old. Like Spencer, Maubach took Dylan to the Crab expert in Pittsburgh to see if her son could have a transplant. But it was too late for Dylan too. Burton was right to be skeptical that the changeover from one technology to another would happen quickly. What was supposed to take months dragged into years. Another source of frustration for Burton was that the committee of scientists advising public health kept debating whether Crab screening was worth doing at all. Newborn screening for Crab is controversial in the medical community, and some doctors complain that parents of sick children are pushing prematurely for screening. After reviewing the available research, a federal advisory panel in 2010 chose not to add crab to the core group of diseases that the federal government recommends for newborn screening programs. During Illinois meetings of the Advisory Committee on Genetic Diseases, Dr. Lainey Friedman Ross, a University of Chicago bioethicist and pediatrician, repeatedly warned public health officials that screening every newborn for crab was akin to conscripting babies into an experiment without their parents' consent. New York's experience screening newborns, Ross says, heightened her concerns. Newborn screening for crab involves 2 rounds of tests, both using blood from an infant's heel. The first test, which checks for an enzyme deficiency, can yield false positives, so blood samples flagged in the first round undergo a second and more intensive test that looks for certain genetic defects. One mutation, the kind Keenan has, clearly indicates the most severe form of crab, which appears in infancy and is fatal without a transplant. But the testing in New York also identified other genetic variations for which there is less certainty. A form of crab that appears later in life also can be fatal, but symptoms vary. In the early years of testing in New York, dozens of families were told that their babies had a moderate to high risk of developing crab, but doctors didn't know when the disease might arrive, if ever. To Ross, giving frightening but uncertain information to parents who never asked for their babies to be tested is a form of psychological harm. People are told their child has this potentially horrific condition, and they're waiting for the other shoe to drop, Ross says. And it might drop in the next 6 months, or it might not drop for 30 or 40 years. Also troubling to Ross were the experiences of New York babies who received transplants. Of the first 4 children treated, 2 died of complications and a third wound up with severe developmental and physical disabilities. Ross told public health officials that the crab screening they planned to do was actually research requiring a formal protocol, where parents are informed of the risks and choose to have their baby tested. Such research, she said, must be overseen by an independent board that protects the rights of research subjects. After Dr. Lamar Hasbrook became Director of Public Health in 2012, he declined to take that advice. In an August letter, he stated that the law had assigned the department a narrow role to pilot, calibrate and scale up testing. This role didn't involve research and didn't require the approval of an institutional review board, he wrote. Burton says she doesn't discount the anxiety parents must feel knowing that crab may be in a child's future. But knowledge of that risk, in her view, gives those families a chance to intervene with a transplant when it's needed. Escolar, the crab expert in Pittsburgh, says her transplant patients with later-onset crab have done remarkably better than those treated as newborns, in part because their form of the disease is less aggressive. The later you develop symptoms, the better outcome you have from the transplant, Escolar says. In recent years, a new blood test for elevated levels of a lipid called cycosine has provided more clarity to families who once faced uncertainty. Public Health includes this test in its screening protocol. A high level of cycosine is an early marker of active disease, signaling the need for an immediate transplant, Burton says. Doctors also have improved the transplant process and figured out that children who undergo the procedure in the first month of life fare better. To Burton, the decision whether to have a transplant should rest with parents, not doctors or bureaucrats. By failing to implement the 2007 law, she says, Illinois is robbing parents of that choice. Even the ones who die of transplant complications, their families haven't said, I wish we didn't. They know they gave their child a chance, Burton says. And there are examples of kids who've done beautifully. On paper, Gina Rugari had one of the worst outcomes of any child in the original New England Journal of Medicine study. The Cincinnati girl died of crab, 15 years after her transplant. Gina used a power wheelchair to get around and an assistive technology device to communicate. But to her mom, Anne, those disabilities never defined Gina, a smart social butterfly who wanted to travel the world. Like many teenagers, Gina had strong opinions, from the designs painted on her fingernails to the sites in Paris and Hawaii she wanted to visit. Gina was a Girl Scout, a movie buff, a good friend. Anne Rugari lost her son Nick to crab just after his first birthday, which is why Gina became one of the first children with crab to receive a transplant. If Gina's mom could go back in time, would she make the same choice? God, yes, I'd do it again and again and again to have those experiences, for her to have life, for her to have love, Anne Rugari says. I was given 15.5 wonderful years with Gina. That's 14.5 more than I had with Nick, and I wouldn't change any of it. Spencer is an artist who spots beauty in places where others see trash. Through Spencer's lens, a discarded bag animated by a Lake Michigan breeze became the image of a bird. A deflated balloon splattered with paint transformed into a clownfish. A River North gallery featured both photographs. Crab disease left Spencer with an eye for scenes of what might have been. In July 2012, Spencer was driving to pick up Tamsin at summer school in the West Loop. Keenan was asleep in his car seat. They stopped at a red light, and Spencer caught sight of a young man waiting on the corner. He was in his 20s, she figured, attractive and well-dressed. He had dusty blonde hair, just like Keenan. The young man smiled as a car pulled up. A woman inside got out, and they embraced. My mind immediately races into the future, a future for Keenan that will never be, Spencer wrote later that day on a blog she had started about Keenan. Before me is a mirage of potential and possibility shifting in the sunlight trying to take shape. There will be no culmination of collected moments to answer my questions. What will he look like? Who will he be? Spencer's eyes lingered on the couple until the light turned green, snapping her back into the life she had now. She glanced into the rearview mirror at Keenan. He was awake then. No one, she wrote, wants a parent to project on him what he isn't and can never be, least of all Keenan. Public Health came close to screening all Illinois newborns for crab in 2014. Early that year, the Chicago lab tested at least 15,000 randomly chosen newborn blood samples for crab and the other lysosomal disorders. New York's state lab agreed to perform the second-round tests that would flush out false positives and confirm real cases. Those tests showed that none of the babies initially flagged had crab disease. Dykes, the Illinois lab's regulatory director, included Burton and other medical advisors on the email he sent to hospitals announcing the start of a broader pilot testing program that August. I think it is finally going to happen this time, Burton wrote to her Lurie colleagues. When it came time for Public Health to sign a contract with the New York lab for the confirmatory tests, however, everything fell apart over a single clause, records show. The boilerplate in Illinois state contracts includes an indemnification clause that provides legal protections for the state. Attorneys for the New York lab pushed for their own language. Public health lawyers, unwilling to put the state at risk, rejected New York's clause. Burton, once again, was exasperated. Public Health had known for 7 years that this crucial testing was needed to avoid unnecessarily alarming families and putting their babies through unneeded, invasive tests. And yet, the state had no backup plan. An advisory subcommittee Burton chaired held an emergency conference call with public health officials that September. The officials explained that Mayo Clinic was willing to do the same tests at its lab, but the state hadn't started the lengthy bidding process to secure a contract. That November, Public Health went forward with pilot testing for the other lysosomal disorders, which didn't need second-round tests, but put crab on hold. The state lab's mass spectrometry machines were actually screening blood spots for the crab enzyme while they performed the other tests, but the lab made adjustments so the crab data weren't recorded. Once again, the lab's Dykes told Burton and her colleagues this would be only a short delay, less than 4 months. After waiting so long for crab testing, a few months didn't seem like a big deal to Burton. If I had known then what would happen later, I would have objected, she says. Over and over again, they made us think it was going to happen. But it didn't. As Keenan's brain deteriorated, he reached birthday after unexpected birthday. When Keenan turned 2, Spencer and Vidchak held Tamsin's hands as big sister jumped on her parents' bed dancing to Green Day's Holiday. Spencer iced Keenan's cake with red buttercream frosting, red because it was the easiest for his dwindling vision to see, and buttercream because the smell is unmistakable. See more videos on his 3rd birthday, the one Spencer didn't think she'd see, she wrote to her Facebook friends. Although there will be much celebrating, none is required because Keenan is 3 is a self-contained celebration. My heart beats in fireworks for you today, Keenan. Keenan made it to his 4th birthday, then his 5th. Those early years with crab were filled with a different sort of firsts for Keenan. First seizures. First need for supplemental oxygen. First time he turned blue. Being upright restricts Keenan's airway, so he needs to be either lying down or reclined in his wheelchair when he is struggling to breathe. As the disease damaged Keenan's nervous system, his spine curved unnaturally. His shoulders hunched up to his ears, and his chest became concave. Eventually, his hips dislocated. Before Keenan got sick, Spencer ran an art installation business with her husband. Dan Vidchak took over the lion's share of the family business duties while Spencer devoted her time to Keenan, a full-time job. She spent day after day trying to undo the constriction of Keenan's muscles with heating pads, massage and range of motion exercises. His eyes grew distant as he lost most of his sight. His senses of hearing and taste were fading. And yet, it was obvious when he was in pain, his face contorting when the disease forced his muscles from head to toe to contract in spasms. Spencer grew awed by Keenan's ability to adapt to physical adversity. A typical preschooler takes at least 20 breaths per minute. Keenan was able to keep the oxygen concentration in his blood at a near-perfect 98% while only taking 4 to 6 breaths per minute. What Keenan is performing on a physiological level makes him a breathing genius, a superstar, a gold medal Olympian, Spencer wrote on her blog. If you need something amazing to happen today, it is him. The normal respiratory ailments of childhood are perilous for children with CRAB. Any one of them can be deadly. Many times Spencer reached out to Facebook friends asking that they hold Keenan in their thoughts and prayers. She described one particularly bad bout of seizures and wheezing as an awake coma, eyes open, but physically and mentally unresponsive. Yet, Keenan pulled through when many of his peers with CRAB did not. Though she once couldn't imagine herself using the suction machine, Spencer began threading the catheter into Keenan's throat so often to clear his secretions that the machine's jarring sounds became the background noise of their lives. Spencer pulled over in traffic so frequently to suction Keenan that their trips to pick up Tamsin from school didn't feel safe anymore. She needed help, and got someone. Keenan qualified for nursing assistance at home. At first, nurses came for several hours each weekday. As Keenan got older, the hours increased. Spencer, who has slept beside her son since his diagnosis, became chronically sleep-deprived. She feared she would nod off and miss the fact that Keenan was suffocating. Spencer wakes up regularly, not only to suction him but also to thump on his chest with a percussor cup, a rubber device that helps breaks up congestion. Each night as Keenan sleeps, his chest lifts in the gesture of an inhale but stops short. No air enters his lungs, no oxygen passes to his blood. Spencer wrote on Facebook, his mouth opens wider. He is trying harder. His chest. Stuck. Again. All the air right here in this very room without a means. Please enter. I beat on his chest, force air into his mouth, lift him up in my arms. Jumpstart the mechanism. Thank you, Keenan. Thank you for breathing. Dylan Maubach, the Washington, ill boy with CRAB, died in his sleep in November 2014. We always hoped his death would be peaceful, says his mom, Robin Maubach. It went just how we hoped and prayed it would. Something tells me that's what Dylan wanted for us. The following spring, Logan Nichols was born at Stroger Hospital on Chicago's West Side. He was sick, but as his mother took him from doctor to doctor, no one could agree on why. This sort of medical odyssey is common with a rare disease when there is no screening. CRAB is estimated to occur in 1 in 100,000 people, and New York found that the form that appears in infancy is even more rare. Many pediatricians will never encounter a case. As a group, though, lysosomal diseases are more prevalent. In the first 15 months of screening newborns for 5 lysosomal disorders, 1 out of 5,000 Illinois babies was diagnosed with one. It would take nearly 2 years of uncertainty and multiple hospitalizations before Logan's mom, Charmaine Jenkins, would learn that her son had CRAB. Spencer woke up one night in June 2015 to find foam pouring out of Keenan's mouth. She suctioned him, but he made more. He had been on supplemental oxygen for allergies that whole month. When she went to sleep, a pulse oximeter showed Keenan's blood oxygen levels were safely above 90%. But now the oximeter showed his levels were in the 50s, dangerously low. He was taking short, sharp breaths. It was 3 a.m., and Spencer had no idea how long had been like this. She turned the oxygen concentrator as high as it could go. No change. I googled white foam, she later wrote. 2 possible scenarios: seizures or respiratory death. I knew we weren't dealing with seizures and thought, this is it. This is the day Keenan dies. What do I do? Do I call his hospice nurse? Do I wake Dan? Her mind raced until she settled on one other possibility. What if there was a hole in the plastic tubing delivering the oxygen? She raced to the closet and searched frantically for new tubing. Lo and behold, that was it. She wrote on Facebook. Keenan's oxygen goes back up, his respiration relaxes, he stops producing foam, he wakes up to his baselines. Everything goes back to normal, except for me. Spencer's husband watched Keenan that afternoon. She took Tamsin downtown. They danced at a Chicago Cultural Center exhibit on house music, then went across the street to Maggie Daley Park. Surrounded by the laughter and roar of 1,000 children, I climbed through apparatuses and went down slides too small for me. One made my stomach drop so much, I screamed. Sometimes the only thing you can do for yourself is reset the button. You are taking too long. Natasha Spencer feared her voice would crack as she spoke to public health officials responsible for implementing CRAB testing in Illinois. So she wrote her statement to Barbara Burton's subcommittee in advance, using all capital letters for that sentence, though she needed no reminding of the exasperation those words carried. It was September 2015, and Illinois still wasn't testing its newborns for crab disease, 8 years after passage of the law requiring the state to do so. Statewide testing for 5 other lysosomal disorders had begun that May. The state lab's machines were testing newborns for the crab enzyme, but the lab wasn't recording the data. Public health officials said they still needed an outside lab to perform the second-round tests to weed out false positives. Mayo Clinic was willing to perform the confirmatory tests, but nobody had approved that contract. What's more, money was drained from the newborn screening fund again. The extra charge to hospitals had amassed more than $15 million to fund testing for crab and the other lysosomal disorders. But that year, the legislature passed a law that allowed state officials to raid the newborn screening fund again. This time, they diverted $5 million to pay for other state programs, records show. By then, DeSykes had left public health for a job in Tennessee, and it wasn't clear to Burton who was in charge of making the crab screening happen. Illinois had a new governor and a new public health director, and the Lurie geneticist felt like she was pushing her boulder up a hill again. Earlier that summer, Burton had invited Spencer to join the Public Health Advisory Subcommittee the Lurie doctor chaired when the two shared a taxi to the airport after a symposium on crab disease. When it came to the impasse in Illinois, Burton thought who better to hammer home the urgent need for testing than a mother caring for a child with crab. Spencer surmised that many of the state employees who appeared before Burton's group mustering excuses for their inaction had never seen a child with crab and knew little of the daily suffering endured. During Spencer's first meeting, a conference call that July, she sat quietly as a contractor explained that unfilled state jobs might be slowing down the review of the Mayo Clinic contract. At the September meeting, however, Spencer scolded the group, which included state lab officials and public health administrators. When I hear there is turnover in staff, delaying this another 6 months, that is not justification for another child and family to live through a variation of our scenario, she told them. Spencer asked each of them to open their mouths as wide as they could, then inhale. That breathless feeling, the sensation of drawing air with one's throat muscles, is what Keenan experiences every moment, she explained. She wished she could see whether they were trying this exercise as they sat in their state offices, to know whether her words resonated. He can throw me a look when I walk into the room that says, "Mom, suction me because the nurse isn't doing a good enough job," she told them. And if he can do that, then he is also aware of how difficult it is to breathe. This shouldn't take 8 years, she implored them. Then she repeated it, "You are taking too long." Spencer and Burton both remember the uncomfortable silence that followed. That same month, Spencer requested a meeting with Dr. Nirav Shah, the global health physician and attorney whom Gov. Bruce Rauner appointed public health director in January 2015. In a letter, Spencer invited Shah to step into her shoes for 30 minutes, describing an experience a few days earlier. The story she told to Shah began happily. "It was time to leave for physical therapy, a 10-minute walk from our house on a beautiful day. Even better, Keenan will go swimming, an activity he loves. His 7-year-old sister, Tamsin, has her shoes on and is ready with her scooter," she wrote. Spencer lifts Keenan into his kid cart, a wheelchair that keeps his body reclined, but then notices that he can't breathe. Whatever transition his body just went through from floor to chair has aggravated the physical obstruction in his airway. He is making a gasping sound. "My adrenaline surges because, now, I feel helpless." She makes her usual adjustments, moving pillows, changing the wheelchair's angle, propping Keenan's body with rolled-up blankets. Nothing helps. Should she cancel or plow ahead if she can just get Keenan to the therapy pool at La Rabida Children's Hospital? She knows he'll be fine. This is temporary, she tells herself. Spencer stops to suction him, threading the floppy catheter into his throat while the machine connected to it suctions the secretions. As soon as she puts away the catheter, Keenan needs suctioning again. With Keenan still struggling to breathe, Spencer adjusts the kid cart again. A rule of thumb for crab families: what doesn't work 1 minute might work the next. She notices an improvement, perhaps only 5%, but enough to get me out the door. Across the street I push his cart as fast as I can in between stops to suction. I walk alongside, talking Keenan through while holding his jaw so he can breathe. Every single bump, crack and sidewalk groove can be felt in the torque of my waist, shoulder and wrist trying to steer the handlebar. She dodges the tree branches that the city hasn't cleared and stops short when curious Tamsin stoops to pick up $1 lying on the ground. Meanwhile, the rubber suction catheter, which has the consistency of a wet noodle, keeps falling out of its protective sleeve. Spencer contorts her body to hold Keenan's jaw at the same time she propels the wheelchair, which weighs about 100 pounds with Keenan in it and the suction machine attached. This frenzied routine, stop, suction, start again, turns a leisurely 10-minute trip into a 30-minute ordeal until the Lorabita doors slide open and she wheels Keenan along a smooth hospital floor to the therapy pool changing area. Keenan is fine. The walk home is uneventful. Things are okay. Then they're not. Then they are again. Imagine this same scenario from Keenan's point of view. Without exaggeration, this is an average day. In her letter, Spencer then explained to Shaw that she is a member of Burton's subcommittee, so she has learned from his own employees about the state's failure to implement the law that called for screening every Illinois newborn for CRAB before Keenan was born. His department, she wrote, seemed to have everything in place to begin screening newborns for CRAB except a sense of urgency. 8 years is not being thorough and responsible, Spencer wrote. It fringes on the opposite. She explained that Ilan Maubach missed a chance for a transplant and died the prior November. Lives, she wrote, were at stake. Spencer's letter sent public health officials scrambling. Connie Moody, a deputy director in charge of the office that oversees newborn screening, wanted to know why Spencer knew so much about the holdups, records show. In an email she asked Claudia Nash, a newborn screening manager who regularly attended Burton's subcommittee meetings, about Spencer. How would she be privy to these details? Nash sent Moody a list of each of the 6 times since 2012 that Spencer had phoned, via emailed or attended public health meetings that discussed CRAB. Of Spencer, Nash wrote, she has always been extremely pleasant. Moody ordered Nash to construct a timeline of events on CRAB testing to provide the director with context. So Nash detailed public health's missteps in bullet point after bullet point, including the dates in the past when state employees had wrongly predicted testing would begin. Nash also included the dates of the 13 meetings Burton's subcommittee had held since 2008, during which the group's medical professionals had devised protocols for public health to catch the real cases of CRAB in newborns while weeding out the false positives. After sending this timeline to Moody, Nash forwarded it to a coworker with a more candid assessment of the delays. Mind-boggling, and that is the condensed version. Nash added, start, stop, how many times? Her colleague shot back, I know. With large lapses of time. Nash later vented to Moody when the agenda for a public health managers meeting included a planned discussion of the second-round confirmatory tests for CRAB under the heading Should this testing be provided? After nearly a decade of explaining repeatedly why these tests were critical, Nash likened the situation to Bill Murray's 1993 movie about reliving the same day over and over again. Groundhog Day. Nash told Moody, we had to go over it all again about why this was needed, seems to be going in circles. Spencer wondered whether Shaw, public health's director, had even bothered to read the story she shared about Keenan. Shaw never granted Spencer a meeting. Instead, he sent Spencer a letter that made no mention of her son and oddly thanked her for sharing your personal story of supporting families affected by CRAB disease. The same passage, records show, previously appeared in a letter Shaw sent to an out-of-state advocate for families of children with CRAB. The letter bearing Shaw's signature told Spencer what she already knew, that public health was working to secure a contract with an outside laboratory that could conduct the confirmatory tests. This process, the letter said, will ensure that we identify a laboratory that can perform the molecular test for CRAB in a timely manner, with high quality, and within cost parameters. The letter wrapped up by saying, we recognize the significant impact this disease has on children and their families and assure you that we are working diligently to implement CRAB screening. Shaw's letter arrived at a time when Keenan's breathing problems had grown so severe that the only way Spencer could help him was to hold his jaw at a certain angle, a position she maintained for hours on end until her arm went numb. She wasn't going to let Shaw brush her off. In an email to Moody, Spencer explained how disappointed she was with the director's response. I was hopeful it would include specific information on where we stand now and a timeline moving forward, Spencer wrote. She asked Moody to tell her where the Mayo Clinic contract stood in the state's approval process. Moody's reply, which arrived 3 weeks later, made it sound like CRAB testing was nowhere in sight. Due to the delays in obtaining spending authorization for the current fiscal year, we find it is necessary to conduct a thorough review of options, Moody told Spencer. We hope to have decisions made as soon as possible. Unfortunately, the state procurement process is an intricate and time-consuming process, exacerbated by the state's current funding situation. What Spencer hadn't been told was that the future of the state lab's newborn screening program was up in the air. After Ronner toured the Chicago lab in October 2015, Public Health Director Shaw asked his senior staff to explore outsourcing not just crab tests but all newborn screening to a private contractor. A department official warned Matt Charles, who oversees the entire division of laboratories, to avoid fear-mongering in his presentation at a strategy session Shaw scheduled for senior staff. Internally, Charles and his colleagues wrote that the cost of newborn screening at the state lab was not sustainable. They predicted that a private lab would charge $55 per baby for the same testing that cost Illinois $110 at that point, records show. Marshall Wilson, the Oregon boy who gave Spencer her first glimpse of a life with crab, died in a hospital emergency department waiting room at the age of 6. Every aspect of his death in March 2016 felt cruel to Spencer. On Facebook, she reflected on the transformative day she met the boy, his little brother and his parents just after Keenan's diagnosis of Marshall. 4.5 years later, my designated, reigning boy champion of outliving crab disease, can die, so will Keenan. If Marshall can be taken out by a stomach virus, he would easily have survived a year, 6 months, 3 months, even 1 month prior in an waiting room with his mother ill and 4 hours away. Then I am again bleakly reminded that this disease reigns free, void of Keenan's strength or regard for my role as his mother. And so, I grieve Marshall, his symbolism, a friendship now transitioning out of the privilege of empathy and into a more distant sympathy and the loneliness I feel because of it. Marshall's little brother, Michael, remained a symbol of what Keenan's life might have been like if he had received a transplant at birth. Later that year, Spencer posted a video on her Facebook page of Michael Wilson zip-lining. She had to remind her incredulous friends he is 4 months older than Keenan and likewise, born with crab. Michael, who just turned 7, still shows no signs of the disease. None of the pressure Burden and Spencer had applied was working. So Burden dashed off another angry email to the latest public health official who refused to tell her when crab testing would start. I feel like this is a complete runaround, she wrote in May 2016. I think it is absurd that crab testing was legislated in 2007 and we have yet to test one single newborn. Like Spencer, the Lurie doctor tried setting up a meeting with Shaw, the director. In a phone call that summer, Burden recalls, Shaw blamed the state's Byzantine procurement process for the lag time in finalizing the contract with the Mayo Clinic. That system, by design, requires precise steps be followed and builds in multiple layers of review, a time-consuming process that can be traced to the path between Illinois state offices and prison. Chronic wrongdoing begets rules designed to prevent it. Policymakers created new regulations and paper trails to thwart unscrupulous employees who would otherwise throw lucrative state business to companies for kickbacks, as one public health chief of staff did a few years before Keenan was born. Indeed, former Illinois Gov. George Ryan wound up in prison for steering state business to cronies for bribes. The new contracting rules, however well-intentioned, increased the time it took to award state business. A contracting process for confirmatory crab tests that started in 2014 still wasn't settled 2 years later. The invitation for bid for the 100 to 130 confirmatory tests the lab anticipated it would need annually to weed out false positives was 40 pages long. At first, a state purchasing officer rejected the Mayo Clinic bid because the pricing was entered in the wrong place, records show. Must start over on procurement, the chief of the Division of Labs wrote in February 2016. 6 months later, the revived bid was rejected. The reason Mayo Clinic wasn't registered with the Illinois Secretary of State's office, records show. Nash, who had compiled the bullet points on earlier missteps, emailed Deputy Director Moody to express her frustration. Well, it seems like they could have figured this out from the time the bid was in, not months later. Some public health managers, anticipating the precarious nature of the procurement process, had pursued a parallel track that led to a workaround. The state lab would use the University of Illinois at Chicago Medical Center, which already had a contractual relationship with Mayo Clinic, as a go-between. Public Health first broached the idea in January 2015, but it took more than 20 months to iron out an agreement with UIC. After the back and forth between lawyers came to an end, the agreement sat for weeks waiting for Shaw's signature. Is your director planning on signing the agreement? A UIC employee asked Public Health in October 2016. It's been about 3 weeks now. Please advise us what the delay is. Shaw signed the agreement that month. But even then, crab testing didn't begin. The following March, Spencer snapped a photo of Keenan at the Shed Aquarium. Reclined in his wheelchair, Keenan was in front of the giant Caribbean reef tank, his eyes barely open. For 6 years now, I've known him better than anyone, yet his inner life remains a mystery. In most respects, he's completely dependent, Spencer wrote on Facebook. In others, utterly alone. That longing to understand her son became overwhelming during the rare moments when Keenan unexpectedly behaved like a typical child. Once, as she leaned in to give Keenan a kiss, his lips closed in what felt like a pucker. Maybe the nerves were connecting, and it was intentional. Maybe it was an involuntary response to stimuli, or maybe I cut him short of a hard-earned swallow, she wrote. Whatever the reason, I'll never forget the feeling. I kiss him all the time, but we don't kiss. I hug him all the time, but we don't hug. It's an ache for him as much as for me, Dan and Tamsin. Moments like these are emotionally dangerous because they promote this exact thinking, but we have gotten very good at pulling ourselves back, staying in the moment, hovering between wanting and needing. The latest holdup in Illinois involves software. Public health officials explained to Burton's subcommittee in April that they were waiting for PerkinElmer, a private contractor, to add CRAB to the computer program that takes the data from the mass spectrometers, interprets the results and generates reports for pediatricians. Richard Zimmerman, who is in charge of quality control and regulatory compliance for all state labs, said his department hoped to have everything in place to begin testing Illinois newborns for CRAB by late summer or early fall of this year. At a follow-up meeting in June, Zimmerman hedged we're at the mercy of PerkinElmer. Initially they told us that was their timeline. But with any development in algorithms of its computer language, sometimes things take a little longer. He assured Spencer, Burton and everyone else on the conference call that this is a priority. We're trying to push it along as best we can, he said. Just as Spencer feared, at least 2 more Illinois babies were born with CRAB after she warned Public Health Director Shaw of this danger. Their conditions were not diagnosed until it was too late for a transplant. Lana Shelton, a North Riverside baby born in July 2016, was diagnosed at Lurie in November, the nerve damage well underway. Lana's pediatrician sent her to Lurie neurologists after her parents, Laura and Don Shelton, noticed that Lana at 4 months old wasn't holding her head up as well as she had been and didn't smile like other babies her age. I just want to see her smile, Laura Shelton says. Lana never did. Spasms and breathing trouble repeatedly landed Lana in the intensive care unit over the summer, and she had to get a feeding tube after she lost her ability to nurse. Hayden Ponce, a Coal Valley, Ill. baby born in January, was diagnosed at Children's Hospital of Illinois in Peoria in June. Doctors told her parents, Killy and Nick Ponce, that Hayden's breathing was so shallow they feared that if they intubated her for the feeding tube surgery, she might spend the rest of her life on a ventilator. Her parents declined and met the hospice team that would see them through the rest of her short life. The July meeting of Burton's advisory subcommittee quickly grew tense. Just a few weeks earlier, Logan Nichols had died of CRAB at the age of 2. By the time Logan was diagnosed at Lurie earlier this year and became one of Burton's patients, his disease was in the final stages. As the conference call began, Logan's death weighed on the minds of Burton, Spencer and Terry Hammonds, another mom who joined the subcommittee. Hammond's son, Liam, died of CRAB in 2001. Asked about the late summer early fall projection for CRAB screening, a public health official pushed back the timeline to sometime in fall. Zimmerman, the lab's regulatory director, was even more vague. We're hoping to have everything up and running by the end of the year, he said. Hammonds told Zimmerman there had been a recent funeral for an Illinois child who died of CRAB, a reference to Logan. Time, she said, is of the essence. Zimmerman responded, I can't give you a definitive time and date. We're hopeful, and we're doing our best. Burton told the public health officials on the conference call that their priorities were messed up. Said Burton, it's almost mind-boggling that we're on a call discussing this in 2017 related to legislation passed in 2007. Zimmerman said PerkinElmer, the private contractor whose software needed changing, was busy working on another project for the lab and would focus on CRAB after that was done. A colleague of Zimmerman's explained that if the state put that other project on hold for CRAB, PerkinElmer would lose 6 months of its work. That was the breaking point for Spencer. What was 6 months of work, she thought, when they had been waiting nearly 10 years for CRAB testing? Her voice rose with fury as she addressed the group. What if it's not running by 2017 and we're looking at 2018? Spencer asked. This is what I've been hearing about since my son was diagnosed in 2011. It's been 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, then years. It's infuriating to be told maybe fall, maybe 2017. I realize everyone is doing their job, but at what point does someone do something more than their job? That's my frustration. We've had 3 new diagnoses these past few months. Hayden Ponce, the baby, who was diagnosed in June, died in her mother's arms at her home in Coal Valley on September 25. She was 7 months old. Here's how crab screening began in 2 other states. Kentucky's governor signed a crab screening law in March 2015. The state contracted with Mayo Clinic to perform all of the tests needed and had its program running by February 2016. That December, the screening caught a baby boy with crab. As a result, Ty Darasett had a transplant when he was 24 days old. His family actually lives in a small town in Tennessee. His mom, Amanda, chose to give birth at the hospital 12 miles north, across the border in Kentucky. Had she gone to the hospital 12 miles south of her home, Ty's disease would not have been caught because Tennessee wasn't screening for crab then. Darasett recently posted on Facebook a video of Ty, now 10 months old, giggling as he bounced up and down in his Finding Nemo jumper. She gave him the first taste of a Dairy Queen ice cream cone last week. Says Darasett, thank God he was born in Kentucky. In July, Tennessee began its own testing program for crab, joining New York, Missouri, Kentucky and Ohio. It took 2 years to implement Tennessee's crab screening law. A state lab in Nashville performs the enzyme tests and uses PerkinElmer and Mayo Clinic for the confirmatory ones. It's hard to surprise Spencer, given all she's been through. But as she was washing the dinner dishes one night this summer, the scene in her living room took her breath away. Tamsin, then 8 years old, was sitting at Keenan's feet in her pajamas. Keenan's vision and hearing are limited, but his mom says she can tell from his respirations and facial expressions that he loves getting his big sister's undivided attention. Without warning that night, Tamsin started singing Virtus Va, Pensiera. See more videos. Singing is like breathing for Tamsin, something done so routinely she doesn't think of it as a talent. On the rare occasions Tamsin does something that merits scolding, she has stormed off to her room to cry. Her parents hear the sobs intermingled with singing until the crying turns into words, and all they hear is song. That Spencer was hearing her daughter sing Italian opera wasn't really a surprise either. Tamsin is a member of the Chicago Children's Choir, which performs numbers spanning genres and languages. Yet, as those mournful Italian words, Hebrew slaves lamenting the loss of their homeland, filled the room in the dim light, the connection between sister and brother bordered on the sacred to Spencer. Tamsin has wrestled with the idea of Keenan dying from her earliest days. As a toddler with her baby dolls, Tamsin's play routinely included taking a picture of their brains. As she got older, Tamsin struggled to understand why she got in trouble, but Keenan didn't. When the word infraction appeared on her third-grade vocabulary list, Tamsin wanted to know why Keenan never committed any infractions. Spencer had to explain gently to Tamsin that she wished Keenan could, but he couldn't. One time Tamsin said she wanted to have crab so she and Keenan could sit in connected chairs and watch their mom feed them both through their G-tubes. She was only 4, her mom recalls, when she first said, "When I grow up, I want to have him, and that makes me sad." Helping Tamsin work through that sorrow has been among Spencer's biggest challenges. But as Spencer listened to Tamsin sing Virtus opera to Keenan, the roles had shifted. She saw Tamsin sharing with Keenan the power of song to release grief. She was offering that coping to her brother, Spencer recalls. What was beautiful about that moment was that my children transcended it for me. I didn't do any work. It was Tamsin and Keenan that made the moment for me. I got to be a witness. When Tamsin was done, Spencer asked her to sing the song again so she could preserve that memory with a video. It wasn't the same the second time. It didn't need to be. The Illinois Department of Public Health now anticipates it can begin statewide screening for crab by the end of the year. In a statement to the Tribune, the department didn't provide a specific target date. Through a spokeswoman, Director Nirav Shah and other current public health employees declined to comment. Melanie Arnold, the department's spokeswoman, acknowledges that the state is now on Plan D. Implementing testing for crab has taken longer than we wanted, she says in a written statement. Outsourcing all newborn screening to a private company is no longer being considered, she says. Arnold adds that PerkinElmer is not to blame for the software delay. While it may sound as simple as a quick software change to finalize implementation for crab, it's actually very complicated with numerous steps and moving parts to coordinate, she says. A spokesman for PerkinElmer says states and their labs set their own agendas and prioritize their own projects. Des Iques, the former regulatory director for Illinois Labs, declined to be interviewed. Nash, the public health manager who had likened the bureaucratic process to the movie Groundhog Day, retired from the department but still works as a contract employee. She says the staff in the lab and the screening follow-up program are dedicated to helping babies. Many state employees, she says, have been frustrated that launching crab screening is taking so long, but she considers this an anomaly. It's a horrible disease, Nash says. We're moving forward with our target and at this point we're working hard to get things implemented. This is the cost of a decade of bureaucratic dysfunction in Illinois. Keenan, Dylan, Logan, Lana and Hayden were all born after the 2007 crab screening law passed. Each might have been helped by a transplant. None of them got that chance. 3 are dead. The brainstems of the other 2 are disintegrating. There may be more than those 5. Our whole state government is such a broken down horrible mess, Burton says. What can I tell a parent to do? The sad thing is these parents deserve to make choices for their child. We let them go until there's no treatment option when we've had a law on the books for 10 years. To me, it's a travesty. She wonders how many more will be born before Illinois starts screening newborns for this disease. I've watched all these other states come on after us, and they're doing it, and here we are still waiting, Burton says. That waiting cost Keenan and his family in ways that only a parent can measure. Look at this little boy, Spencer says. I was counting on him to tell me what it's like to be a boy. Keenan is lying motionless in his wheelchair, reclined so gravity doesn't restrict his airway. The mere act of sliding elastic waist pants onto his small frame that morning made his whole body shake in pain. A blanket, decorated with superheroes, is draped over him because he can no longer regulate his own body temperature. He is 6 years old, and he is dying. Spencer doesn't know what he likes or dislikes. The superheroes on the blanket are just a guess. This final stage of crab, Spencer says, is like having a short in the wire of a lamp. You can wiggle the cord, and the lamp will sometimes light up. But at a certain point, it won't anymore. The brainstem stops telling the heart and lungs what to do. And no amount of thumping on a chest will help. She is ashamed of her state government. If anyone dares to congratulate themselves when they finally implement this, that's when Spencer interrupts herself to tamp down her anger. The words that follow are sharp and staccato. I'll have something to say. Spencer's voice softens as she turns to her son. Right, Keenan. Keenan's blue eyes, distant and unfocused, don't move. If he has an answer, there is no way for Spencer to know what it is. The time between breaths grows too long, so Spencer holds his jaw at a better angle and coaxes him to take in some air. P. Callahan at ChicagoTribune.com. She investigates how this story was reported. This story is based on 7 months of reporting that included a review of 2,300 emails to and from Illinois Department of Public Health employees. The Chicago Tribune obtained the emails under the State Freedom of Information Act, and attorneys for the newspaper challenged some redactions made by state officials to get additional information released. Dr. Barbara Burton, the Lurie Children's Hospital geneticist who urged legislators to pass a crab disease screening law and repeatedly prodded public health to implement it, shared additional emails and records she kept. The Tribune also reviewed the minutes of meetings of Public Health's Genetic and Metabolic Diseases Advisory Committee and 3 of its subcommittees, dating back 10 years. A Tribune reporter listened to the conference call meetings of the advisory panels held this year and asked questions of participating public health officials. She identified herself as a reporter at each meeting. In addition, the Tribune examined state contracts, procurement regulations and many scientific studies. A reporter found an important cost analysis in the doctoral dissertation of a public health employee. The Tribune sought comment from all public health employees mentioned in this story. Most declined, including current public health director Nirav Shah, David Jenks, Michael Petros and Claudia Nash. Retired Illinois officials who worked on newborn screening agreed to be interviewed. In response to the Tribune, Public Health provided 2 separate statements. George Dizikes, a former lab regulatory chief, forwarded a reporter's written questions to a spokeswoman for the Tennessee Department of Health, where he currently works. The spokeswoman said, "We suggest you focus on those in Illinois who are responsible for the testing." Much of the reporting on Keenan Spencer Vitchak was drawn from the modern-day equivalent of a diary his mother, Natasha Spencer, chronicled on a blog and a Facebook page. Her son's struggles with crab, her family's celebrations of his stamina and her longing to understand Keenan's elusive inner world. There is no official list of babies born with crab in Illinois. The Tribune found the children and their families through Burton, Spencer, Facebook posts and other reporting.